So, you think you might like to do a PhD? Well, I am finally filming a video talking about how you apply for a PhD for those of you that are interested, whether it's just vague curiosity or it's something you think you might like to do in the future, in a few years or in the next year, wherever you may be at and you're just looking for a little bit of information. So a little bit of background on me, if you're not familiar, I am a PhD student at the moment. I am a part-time PhD student at the University of Roehampton in the field of classics. I am studying within the humanities, and I have got some general advice, some pieces of information that you might be interested in if you're applying to do a PhD. But I'll also be talking more generally about my specific experience applying for a PhD, because the thing is, there is no simple format to this. It varies depending on the country or the university or department you're applying to. So the process for applying for, say, a science-based PhD is often quite different from, say, a humanities PhD. Applying to do a PhD in North America can be quite different from applying to do a PhD in Scotland. All of these things change the process, but it's a nerve-wracking process, I admit that. It's also something I don't think there's a lot of information actively shared with people about. It's something you really have to root around to know about. So it's just, I think, nice to talk about it, make it seem a little bit less daunting, and clarify some of the experiences that you might have if you've not had that information shared with you thus far in your academic career, which I feel like can quite easily happen. So I've made some notes in my notebook which will hopefully help me cover everything I need to in this video. So the first point I put in my notes is to mention that oftentimes there's not as strict a deadline for applying for PhDs as there is for applying for, say, an undergraduate or a postgraduate degree. I suppose a PhD is in a way a postgraduate, but you know what I mean, say like a master's or something like that. It's not the same as when you're finishing up secondary school, applying to do your undergraduate degree. There's a set deadline that everybody is applying to, etc, etc. It's very university based. Now, again, this might change depending on the country you're applying in. I can't give you rules for that, but in the UK it's very university based, and you're just going to have to find out what your university and their department is looking for in terms of time, and that might be a deadline that they have imposed, or it may literally just be, we need to decide before term starts. And it might not be something you can find on their website. It might be something you have to email the graduate school about, email your potential supervisors about, and really figure out the deadline for. Now, something that there are deadlines for, and I'm not going to be discussing in depth in this video, is funding. Now, this can have an impact obviously on when you submit your PhD application, because if you're looking for funding, then funding bodies usually have much stricter deadlines, and from my experience of applying to funding, those have been in the springtime. Both the times I've applied for funding, the deadline has been spring. So when I applied for my original PhD, I applied at the same time as applying for funding, so I had to submit that PhD application in spring, because you have to have been accepted for your PhD to get funding. That can't be up in the air. It can be a simultaneous process, but you're not going to apply for your PhD after you apply for funding, as far as I'm aware. It's always the other way around. So that might obviously have an impact on when you're applying, if you're applying for funding. If you're not familiar, I am not fully funded. I have partial funding from my university specifically to cover my fee payments, so I don't have to pay fees, and that was something that my university department was able to offer to me specifically, as they had the money and were happy to do that, and my supervisor sought it out for me. It's not something I can give you a lot of advice on getting, because, as I've mentioned, despite having applied for funding twice, I did not win it. Unfortunately, humanities is incredibly competitive and there's not a lot of funding in it to do graduate degrees in the UK if you're a UK student. So this video is not about funding, but just to keep that in mind if it's relevant to you. You also have to apply to a specific university. So if you're in the UK and apply to go to university in the UK when you're an undergraduate, there's a good chance you use UCAS, which is a system where you apply for up to 5 universities, I believe, is at once, for whatever degree programs you want to do. In this instance, it's not quite like that. It's a little bit more like applying for the Masters, in that you approach a university separately, individually, and go through slightly different channels. It's also a much more intensive application process. So from my experience, there was the first half, which was the written half of the application, where you had to write up a proposal. That proposal will usually include information like your academic background, what you have studied and researched in the past, that gives you the background and the knowledge to be the one to approach this topic. Why are you qualified to be researching what you are requesting to research? It also has to include a proposal of a topic you want to research. Now, in comparison to what my PhD is now, my proposal was far, far vaguer, and there is a 90% chance that what your PhD will become will be much, much narrower than your original application. So as long as you have some idea, as long as you have a route you want to take, don't worry too much if it's still seeming a little bit broad. Your supervisors will probably understand that you're starting from a slightly broader place, and part of that research process will be narrowing down what you're researching. Despite the fact that it will narrow down and probably take new shape as you're researching, things that you might also be expected to include in your application are things like an outline, which will outline what your thesis is going to look like. Your application may require you to answer why you're picking this specific university and your supervisors and details like this, and it's going to vary depending on what university you're at, but it is going to be a few thousand words. It's not going to be nothing. It's certainly a much more substantial application than a undergraduate or postgraduate degree from my experience. You will then, if you get past that phase, have to go for a PhD interview, in which you will be interviewed by academics at that university. So from my experience, I was interviewed by 3 members of staff at the university. I think it was a few years ago now. So I got interviewed for my PhD about 3 years ago. I started 2 years ago, and I got interviewed about just under 3 years ago. And there was 3 people there. There was 2 academics from the classics department who would eventually become my supervisors. The third of my supervisors was not in the country at the time, so couldn't be at my interview, and the 4th person was the head of department for the entire histories, classics, humanities department. So those were the people at my interview, and they quizzed me about all the things you would expect. They wanted more detail from the application I'd submitted. They obviously want to meet you in person. They obviously want to know that you can kind of back up everything you've said in your application, and I found that experience incredibly nerve-wracking because I had never had an academic interview before. Some undergraduate degrees I know require interviews. I know if you go somewhere like Oxford or Cambridge, you're interviewed, and then I know some master's degrees also interview you. Not my experience. I did both my undergrad and my master's at Edinburgh University, no interviewing, and this was my first academic interview, and again, like I said, very nerve-wracking, but it obviously went well because I got my place. So that's okay if you feel nervous. It's like anything, interviews can be really daunting. Now, how do you pick where you do your PhD and what you do your PhD in? I'm sure some of you are wondering. So like I mentioned, you're applying through the university specifically. Now, something you will probably want to do before applying to this university, at least in the humanities, is contact your potential supervisor. When it comes to picking a PhD, what is almost always more important than the specific university you attend is the supervisors that you have for your PhD. So like I mentioned, I have 3 supervisors supervising my research and helping me through things and discussing things with me. And they all have expertise in something related to my research. And you're going to want to pick your supervisors very carefully, and don't just assume that because you want to do a PhD, you will get to do a PhD there. There is no obligation for them to be your supervisor or to offer you a place. They have to want to be your supervisor. They have to be interested in supervising a research student. So you have to approach them beforehand. This can often come in 2 different forms. In some occasions, universities will be advertising an area of research that they want people to come and research. So from my experience, Roehampton was specifically putting feelers out to see if anybody wanted to come to their university to research gender-based violence in antiquity. Now this was something that was relevant to what I was doing for my master's thesis or master's dissertation, and when I saw that they were looking for people to apply to their PhDs in this field, I was like, this is something I want to do my PhD in. It was sent round my department at Edinburgh. They sent round this advertisement. It had been sort of forwarded on to one of our tutors. And it was a few months before the deadline. I think it was maybe February or March or something that they said we want people to apply for this, and there was staff at that university who are now my supervisors, who I was actually citing in my dissertation and had read works by, and was incredibly keen to have as a supervisory team. This just sounded exactly like what I wanted to do. So I got in touch with one of the lecturers who is now my supervisor and said, I would really like to apply to do a PhD at your university in gendered violence. This is my background and this is what I'm specifically interested in. If you're familiar, I look at sexual assault specifically, and that's why I said I wanted to look at sexual violence towards women in classical Athens. And we talked about me and what I'd done and what I was currently researching and interested in, and the lecturer who's now my supervisor encouraged me to apply. So she actually looked at drafts of my application before I officially submitted it. Now in many other cases the university will not be advertising saying we want PhD students who are interested in this field. You have to know that there is a member of staff at the university who is experienced in your field. So say for example you're really interested in researching the Blitz in London during World War II. That's just a random thing that has come into my head, and you are presumably in some way familiar with this topic. You've done your own research, you've been reading books, you've perhaps written essays or your dissertation on it, and you know of an academic at another university, or perhaps at the university you're already at, who is experienced in that field, and you think they're the person that could potentially be my supervisor. You just have to contact them. You just email them and say, I'm a potential PhD candidate. I would really like to research in this area. This is my background. Or is this something you would be interested in supervising? Is this something we could discuss further? You know, just compose and send a polite email. It's something that is really important to establish that beforehand, and then obviously they'll maybe talk to you and say whether that's something they could be of any help with, and you just have a bit of a back and forth, and then they may, like my supervisor did, read over your application beforehand, and that's sort of where you'll begin to get the guidance of how that university works. They'll start telling you, and you can start asking them if they're interested. You can start getting that information. And again, you can always email the graduate school at that specific university. If there's no clear pathway to how you apply there because they've not got some advertisement saying fully funded biomedical PhD, please apply here section on their website, and it can be a little bit more difficult in areas like the humanities where the research isn't necessarily funded by like a government body or that kind of thing. And if you didn't gather from what I was saying before, I applied to do my PhD whilst I was still doing my master's. So like I mentioned, I applied around springtime. I then had my interview in the summer. I was just finishing the top portion of my degree and going into the writing up of my dissertation stage when I was also applying for my PhD, which was quite intense. I also had a Greek exam. There was a lot going on. Intense. That's all I can say. That's when I applied. You certainly don't have to apply while you're still studying though. Feel free to take a year out, take a few years out whenever you are ready. I have a few friends that took a year out and used the year out to apply for their PhD so that they weren't applying for their PhD at the same time as trying to complete their masters. That can be a little bit more relaxing and let you spend a lot more time on your masters if you're finding that to be too much. I actually got accepted to do my PhD and then deferred my beginning date for 6 months, so took 6 months out between my masters and my PhD just to give myself a little bit of a break, although I was so ready to go back when I did. So there's certainly no specific time in your academic career when you have to start your PhD. So that's pretty much how you go about applying for a PhD. In terms of requirements, in case anybody asks, this is just like everything else. It's so non-specific. It is nothing like applying to an undergrad and a master's. There's not a section on their website where it says you have to have 5 GCSEs and 2-1 degree in this specific area. Obviously they will be interested in your qualifications, but this is something you need to discuss with people. So presumably the basic requirements are you're going to have an undergraduate degree in something. Most of the times, at least in the humanities in the UK, you'll be expected to have a master's or a postgraduate degree. Sometimes you don't have to. It's not like, again, these requirements aren't you have to have this, but it's something I think most people would expect you to have. It's also something I would advise doing before doing a PhD, because masters are such an important bridge to going from undergraduate level to research level, as I, at the end of my undergraduate, would not have been prepared for the independent research of a PhD. My master's prepared me for that, and you learn a lot of other research skills whilst doing a master's. So the likelihood is those are the things you'll have. You will also need to get references at some point. So people that you might want to ask for references for your PhD application will include perhaps your master's dissertation supervisor, your undergraduate dissertation supervisor, a member of staff or lecturer that you have some sort of rapport with, a class that you really enjoyed. You perhaps talk to them a lot, discuss things with them, were active in their class, and they would know who you are, and they'd be willing to give you a reference. It may also be that you have worked in a field similar to what you want to do your research in. In that case, somebody that you worked with, an employer or a colleague, may also be a good reference. Again, it's going to depend on what kind of thing you're looking to do, but job experience is not necessarily required. It certainly wasn't for my area. In terms of asking for references, it's just about, again, composing a polite email requesting them. Again, I hope this was helpful. I feel a lot of my advice has just been, it very much varies, but I think it's just comforting to hear from someone who's doing a PhD, as like I mentioned, I don't think that there was that much information actively provided to me prior to my expressing an interest in doing a PhD, and it can be difficult to know where to seek that information out, and it's just hopefully good to have this discussion and open it up, because I'd always like to see more people pursuing their academic interests and not feeling like that isn't a path for them. And I know academia can seem very daunting in certain circumstances. As somebody who came from a working class household, who went to pretty ordinary comprehensive school in Scotland, all of these different things, academia can seem a little bit lofty and out there, but it's wonderful if you find a subject that you're passionate about and you care about and that you want to research further, and I would highly encourage you to pursue that if possible. And I wish you all the best of luck if it's something that you are interested in. So yeah, good luck applying for your PhDs. If you have any more questions, please do leave them in the comments down below, and I will, of course, as always, try my best to answer them. And until next time, happy studying, happy researching, and happy reading. And I'll see you all again soon. Bye.